candidacy in order to defeat Senator Clinton and then turn around and bring down Obama under a mountain of scandals. So the fear of Hillary Clinton is that during the course of this campaign, she's very much come around to realize that the Democratic Party must go back to the traditions of Franklin Roosevelt. And in fact, that FDR legacy and tradition today is alive and well with Lyndon LaRouche and the LaRouche Political Action Committee, and particularly the LaRouche Youth Movement, which is moving to revive the tradition of FDR and to revive the specific policy solutions that Roosevelt adopted immediately upon taking office in 1933. I would urge all of you to go to the current issue of the Executive Intelligence Review, where the cover story is a detailed synopsis of the fight at the 1932 Democratic Convention. And you'll see some very clear parallels to the situation today, where leading financial banking circles, Wall Street interests, tightly aligned with London, are doing everything in their power to prevent Hillary Clinton from getting the nomination. Why? Number one, because they see a very clear pattern in what she's been saying, particularly since the Iowa caucus defeat, that indicates that she is prepared to move in an FDR policy direction to deal with this worst financial crisis, worst economic collapse in the entire history of the United States and the modern world. There is also an underlying fear that if the Clintons get back in the White House, there will be an environment at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue that will be receptive to the policy solutions that have been laid out by Lyndon LaRouche. In fact, immediately upon hearing about the crisis, the bankruptcy of Bear Stearns, LaRouche immediately wrote a 3-part policy document, 1 page, in which he laid out the critical emergency measures that must be taken right now, not after January when a new president is in, but right now, in order to deal with this crisis. What are those 3 points? Number one, Congress must pass with a veto-proof majority the Homeowners and Bank Protection Act, which distinguishes between the vital functions of our federal and state chartered commercial banks, which must be protected, which must be put through bankruptcy reorganization to keep their doors open. And at the same time, there must be an immediate freeze on home foreclosures for a yet-to-be-defined period of time, allowing enough time for the entire financial reorganization to take place and for the entire real estate bubble blowout to be sorted out. Perhaps we're talking 2 or 3 years or more. There should not be a time deadline set on when the freeze on home foreclosures should end. The second thing that we've got to do, as LaRouche lays it out, take critical steps to defend the value of the dollar. And the best way to do that is to establish a 2-tiered credit system. For those people who want to borrow for speculative purposes, interest rates are going to be high. They're going to be higher than the interest rates of the European Central Bank and the Bank of England. We want to build back up the value of the dollar, which has collapsed by 50% against the European currencies since the Bush administration came into office. This is a national security threat that the dollar, as a world reserve currency, is crashing and will continue to crash if the Fed continues their low interest rate policies. So increase interest rates for all of those categories of speculative investment, but set a lower interest rate, 1 to 2%, for those projects that serve the national interest, whether it's the restructuring of mortgages to capital budgeting for major infrastructure that's urgently required, both to create jobs and to actually begin to rebuild the nation's vital infrastructure after 40 years of being torn down with no reinvestment. We've got to have tens of thousands of miles of high-speed rail and maglev transportation built over the next 20 to 40 years. We need an unprecedented proliferation of nuclear power plants. And all of these projects should be done on the basis of targeted credits at 1 to 2% in order to put the country back to work, rebuild our infrastructure, rebuild our industrial base, and turn the situation around both here and globally. The third thing that is also called for by Mr. LaRouche, and which is urgently needed, is an alliance beginning with the four great powers, the United States, Russia, China, and India, the very nations that the British Empire is attempting to draw into a new world war in Eurasia. The U.S., in alliance with Russia, China, and India, must convene an emergency conference, a new Bretton Woods conference, to create a new fixed exchange rate system. Throw out the floating exchange rate system that was imposed in 1971 by people like George Shultz on behalf of London. Go back to 1944 to Roosevelt's fixed exchange rate system. Write off all of the speculative debt. Let the hedge funds go under. Let the investment banks like Bear Stearns that engaged in pure speculative looting activity, let them all go under. And let's go back to an American system approach to rebuilding the world through capital investment in infrastructure, not the fascist PPP programs of people like Felix Rohatyn and George Shultz. Now, over the last several days, President Bush was in Europe and then traveled to Russia for his final summit meeting with President Vladimir Putin of Russia. Ignore everything that you've heard in the media about these various meetings. Ignore the claims that somehow or other Bush and Putin rekindled their personal chemistry between them. The Russians came in the form of President Putin's visit to the Bush family estate in Kennebunkport, Maine, in July of last year, July 2007, and put an offer on the table to revive Lyndon LaRouche's proposal for U.S.-Russian cooperation in building a global shield, a ballistic missile defense shield against nuclear weapons, to end the era of the tyranny and terror of thermonuclear mutually assured destruction. That offer was seriously considered by some in the Bush administration, yet they did not have the political clout to pull it off. And in the meetings that just took place in Romania and then in Sochi in Russia, the bilateral meeting between Presidents Putin and Bush, the Kennebunkport proposal, despite the best efforts of some people in the U.S. military and in other U.S. institutions, was rejected. Why? Because President Bush is a degenerate, and President Bush was unwilling and incapable of reaching a competent and sane diplomatic agreement, even though President Putin extended every available opportunity. So Lyndon LaRouche's assessment is that coming out of the NATO summit, coming out of the Sochi meeting between Bush and Putin, we are very, very close to World War III. The Russians saw the push by President Bush at the NATO summit to have NATO membership extended to Georgia and the Ukraine, two countries bordering on Russia, as an existential threat, as a virtual declaration of war against Russia. The Chinese are looking at the destabilization being carried out now ostensibly around the Tibet situation as a targeted provocation coming out of the United States against China. They see President Bush's hosting of the Dalai Lama at the White House several months back as a provocation.